Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Daniel DePetris. I'm a fellow at Defense Priorities, a foreign policy think tank based in Washington, D.C., advocating for a foreign policy of realism and restraint. It's my pleasure to welcome each and every one of you this afternoon for this event titled U.S. China Competition and the Value of Middle East Influence. I guess I would start this event by saying, it's no secret that the Trump administration is primarily focused on containing Chinese influence, not only in the Indo-Pacific and in particular the Taiwan Strait, but outside the Indo-Pacific as well, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in Africa, and of course, whether it's in the Middle East. And as a matter of fact, over the last several years, China has increased its diplomatic interactions and economic engagement in the region. All 22 members of the Arab League have joined China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is, of course, its signature economic initiative for developing countries across multiple continents. The Chinese have sent significant diplomats in the region, and they signed numerous billion-dollar economic engagement initiatives with many countries in the region, particularly the Gulf states. And increasingly, you see the People's Liberation Army engaging in some, typical military exercises in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. The question, of course, is whether the United States should be influenced or concerned with all this renewed Chinese influence in the Middle East and what the United States should do about it, if anything. We are pleased to welcome three very distinguished panelists who have written and spoken about this topic for years. First up is my friend and colleague, Dr. Rosemary Kelanic, who is the Director of Defense Priorities Middle East Program. She publishes widely on energy security, great power politics, and U.S. grand strategy in the Middle East. She's the author of a recent paper, China Can't Dominate the Middle East, and I recommend everybody read that because it was a stellar piece of work. Next up, we have Jon Hoffman. Dr. Hoffman is a research fellow in defense and foreign policy at CATO Institute and an adjunct professor at George Mason. His expertise is in the history of U.S. involvement in the Middle East geopolitics, and political Islam. He's the author of a forthcoming paper called Aimless Rivalry, The Futility of U.S. China Competition in the Middle East. And then finally, we have Dr. Joshua Eisenman. Dr. Eisenman is professor of politics at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. His research focuses on the political economy of China's development and foreign relations with the United States and the Global South. He's the author of the book, China's Relations with Africa, A New Era of Strategic Engagement, which was published in 2023. Thank you all three for being with us. It should be a very interesting conversation. I kind of want to start it off with a simple question and give you, both of you, or all three of you, 3 to 5 minutes to respond to this. Should the United States be concerned about Chinese engagement in the Middle East? I think there's a conventional assumption that it should be, but maybe you guys have a different take on it. Why or why not? Rose, would you like to start us off? And then we could follow with Jon and then Joshua.
Sure, great. So thanks everybody for coming to listen to us, and thanks Dan for moderating, and thanks to my co-panelists for their insights, which I'm sure will be super interesting and fun to debate. So this question of whether the U.S. should be threatened by Chinese involvement in the Middle East. To put a little bit of meat on the bones, I'll just quickly note that what China has been up to in the Middle East largely is economic, right? Trade in the Middle East has gone up quite a bit from China in the past 10 years, especially. It's been more engaged diplomatically. It helped to broker a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran a couple of years back. Militarily, China hasn't done that much in the Middle East. They have a base in Djibouti, just outside the Middle East. They have a base in Gwadar. Well, they have a port in Gwadar that people think could become a base. They have increased their arms sales to the region, but their arms sales are still much lower than anywhere near what the United States sells to the region. But those are the kind of activities that are going on now that have observers worried. And I think that the United States really does not need to worry about China's growing involvement in the Middle East, even assuming that involvement continues its upward trajectory. And that's for a very simple reason, which is that the United States doesn't have to worry. The United States doesn't have to dominate the Middle East itself for the U.S. to be secure, right? The U.S. at the most just needs to make sure that nobody else can dominate the Middle East. And when I think about China,
Looks like we lost Rose for a little bit. We'll wait till she gets back on. John, you want to pick up on what Rose was maybe saying, or you could, of course, make your own comments, and we'll wait for Rose when she gets back on. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, I would say first, seconding the fact that Rose's paper was fantastic, really breaking down this Cold War 2.0 framing regarding China and the Middle East and why I think we can say it's so nonsensical. If you haven't read the paper, I would go read it immediately. It's great. So on this question of China and the Middle East and should the United States be concerned, I hold a much more skeptical thought on this. I would argue no. China is really an opportunistic actor in the Middle East. It lacks the ability and the will to assume a dominant position in the region akin to what the United States has upheld for decades. It's an opportunist. It's not a revisionist. Beijing is inherently averse to risk-taking in the Middle East. China is far more concerned with domestic issues, political developments in their own neighborhood. And there are also something that I think is also, often overlooked is the several serious constraining factors on Chinese power projection via blue water operations, whether it be in the Middle East or elsewhere. I think it was actually a defense priorities paper by Mike Sweeney that really detailed these limitations. And I would also suggest everybody go read that. But like Rose was mentioning before she was cut off, this doesn't mean China is not disinterested in the Middle East. It's the region's largest oil consumer, largest trade partner, largest investor, but its ability to jeopardize key U.S. interests in the region is limited. At its core, for China, the Middle East is a market. Its main interest is the free flow of oil and trade out of the region, and we, the United States, share those interests. What I argue is that when it comes to China and the Middle East, the greatest threat is not from Beijing, but actually from overreaction inside Washington, D.C., and then from America's regional partners trying to leverage this anxiety in Washington, D.C., that, oh my God, China's going to swoop in and eat our lunch in the Middle East. You need to give us all these concessions to make sure that doesn't happen. And I think this is very, not good for the United States. But to conclude, to go back to Rose here, just to conclude my thoughts, again, I think China's ability to undermine U.S. interests is very limited. Even if China did have the capacity or the ambition to do so, why should we assume that China would be successful in trying to assume such a position in the region? I think the American experience has shown that an external hegemon trying to maintain a regional order requires a lot of resources and runs a pretty high risk of failure. If all of this aid, military sales, widespread military basing and so on doesn't translate into influence for us, why would it for Beijing? So I think this should be a moment for course correction in the Middle East, not doubling down on these grandiose, lofty frameworks and abstract ideas.
Terrific. Thanks, John. Rose, you're back.
I'm back. All right. Sorry about that, everybody. It's, take two, right? Click. Okay. So as I was about to say, okay, have we not cut off again? If we want to understand what a threat to the U.S. in the Middle East looks like, we can look at the Cold War. And I have a paper that came out last month that's been mentioned a couple of times already. But it looks at the historical analog of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And the Soviet Union was a genuine threat to U.S. interests during the Cold War. And it was a threat to U.S. interests because it was local. It shared a 1,000-mile border with Iran, and it had serious Soviet bases in the southern part of the country that were only about 100 or 200 miles from Iran. And it had a demonstrated track record of interfering in the Middle East, right? So throughout the 19th century, early 20th century, the Soviet Union slowly ate up territory that used to belong to the Ottoman Empire and to the Persian Empire, which of course is now present-day Iran. And so the Soviets had this long history of trying to take over parts of what is now the present-day Middle East. They had the ability to do it because they were a superpower and they were so close by. And then, of course, the US, the biggest US fear was that the Soviets would in some way or another gain control over Middle East oil output, either directly or indirectly through proxies. And the fear was if the Soviets gained control of Middle Eastern oil, they could use that to strangle the West, right? Either acutely by denying oil exports from the Middle East to the United States and its NATO allies, and thereby hurt the Western economies in the long-term race that was the Cold War, or that it could deny oil acutely. So everybody sort of believed that if a big war came to pass between the United States and the Soviet Union, it would happen in Europe, in the Central Front, and it was expected that if the Soviets invaded Western Europe, they would simultaneously invade the Middle East and use their invasion to cut off oil supplies going from the Middle East to the United States and its allies in NATO. And the West was actually super pessimistic about their ability to defend the Middle East. And the idea would be that the Soviets would do that to undermine the war effort during the Central Front, along the Central Front during the Cold War. The Soviets were also fearsome towards Middle Eastern oil supplies because they had this, in retrospect, kind of crazy economic system, right? Soviet-style communism, looking back on it today, is really bonkers, right? They actually just sort of guzzled resources as a matter of course and wasted them. And so there was no sort of question about whether the Soviets would sell oil to the West or not, right? They did export oil to the West sometimes and made a lot of money doing so, such as during the height of the 1973-1974 oil crisis. But the Soviets were not profit motivated, right? They could have exported a lot more oil to the West than they actually did. They were very worried about being dependent on the capitalist West. They didn't trust the capitalist West. And they were not looking to make a buck, right? Their own oil requirements were also quite separate from the global oil market. There really were two markets at the time, the Soviet market and its satellites, and the Western market, the rest of the world, right? And so there was fear that the Soviets could take Middle Eastern oil, stick it in their own market, deprive it to the West. And that was a credible thing that they might actually do. China doesn't pose a threat on either count, right? China can't militarily threaten the Middle East. They can't dominate it anywhere like what the Soviets could have done. And the Chinese also are part of the global oil market. So their oil demand is baked into the global oil market. Even if they tried to sop up a bunch of oil or tell exporters in the Middle East, don't sell oil to the West, sell it only to China. Even if those exporters did that, right, the oil that China would have bought is oil that the United States or somebody else could buy. So the market is just completely different. The threat is completely different and much, much, much less than anything that the U.S. faced during the Cold War. All right, back to you all.
Thank you, Rose. Joshua, please go ahead.
Well, this is great. I'm looking forward to a robust discussion. So let me just start off by saying a couple of things. First, the Communist Party of China is a political organization. It has political ends, always political ends. It has economic, military, and political means to achieve those ends, but its ends are always political. Never mistake the ends of the Communist Party of China as being economic. Those are only the means. The second is the Communist Party of China has declared that its enemy is the United States and Western liberalism. This isn't really a debate. It's just a question of what they're going to do to proceed. So far, we've seen, mass hacking campaigns, propaganda, disinformation. So we're the target, right? And we shouldn't forget that, as we enter into the conversation. But another key starting point is that the Middle East is far from China and not really in its core foreign policy interests. I would argue that Africa is more important in terms of simply affirming China's claims to lead the global South. And the Middle East is not actually that important. And, so China's goal in the Middle East is primarily to avoid enemies and expand its economic and tech dominance. And I think the tech dominance aspect of this has been kind of underplayed in our discussion so far. We have a very 20th century understanding of security so far in this discussion. And I want to broaden that to include the cyber and the other aspects, which are very 21st century. Now, if we want to periodize China's engagement in the Middle East, we could say that you have a pre-Xi Jinping period that's more mercantilist, more kind of old school economic. And then with the BRI in 2013 and Xi Jinping, you have a move towards the support of techno-authoritarianism through Huawei, through ZTE, through extensive apparatus of smart cities, etc., being provided. We also see an increasingly pro-Israel China policy up until October 7th. I was actually in China when October 7th happened, so I watched in real time the Chinese pivot from telling us when we arrived on October 5th that the Israeli-China relationship was the best it had been since the founding of both countries. At the end, we had 50 PLA generals accusing Israel of genocide, and Israel hadn't even responded yet. So China pivoted immediately to throw Israel under the bus. I guess the idea was that how could Israel stand up against these foes? Well, I think we know what happened after that, right? So the Iran proxies and got shellacked, and you have this changeover in Syria. And so last month, the new Chinese ambassador in Israel went on Israeli TV with a yellow ribbon condemning Hamas's massacre on October 7th for the first time. It took 600 days for him to actually do that. You know, you might say better late than never, but the upshot is that China's policy has evolved pretty quickly. And there's a few reasons for this. You know, one of the reason is because Trump's deal with the Houthis and negotiations with Iran have created what I've heard Israelis call strategic daylight between Jerusalem and Washington, and a kind of buyer's remorse, which gives opportunity for China's charm offensive, which it's been doing in Europe and Southeast Asia and other parts since the election of Donald Trump. And so Israel remains a kind of key target of this charm offensive, but it's renewed now, given the fact that Israel was so dominant, especially vis-a-vis Iran. So you can see the transition occur from this very pro-Iran, very pro-Hamas, actually, China policy to a much more middle-of-the-road policy. And I was talking to Chinese delegation yesterday who was making that point, which I thought was very interesting. I think it also kind of reaffirms the philo-Semitism that they have in China, this idea that, you know, Jews are powerful and smart. And I think that this idea is actually in China considered a positive in a way that in other Western contexts it's not. And so this affirms this kind of philo-Semitic attitude. So ultimately, I would argue that the U.S. actually has very little choice but to be concerned about China's engagement in the Middle East. There are a lot of pressing problems. Obviously, Israel, Hamas, Gaza, Iran, this new leadership in Syria, you know, what's going to happen with the Houthis who are still launching missiles at Israel. But that requires actually attention, right? Not turning away from it, not saying, okay, we'll leave it for the Chinese, but to actually turn to it and say, we are going to deal with it. Now, is the Trump administration prepared to do that? Probably not. I think my other panelists would know better, actually, whether it is or not. But I'll say this, and I'll conclude with this. If the U.S. does decide to pull back its strategic and defense cooperation with countries in the Middle East, it will only create an opportunity for Chinese state-owned enterprises and technology companies to fill those gaps with Chinese 5G and 6G technology, surveillance state, and smart city technology. You know, getting to the Soviet Union analogy is not necessarily getting us to the point we are now, where those issues are, in my opinion, perhaps more important than, you know, perhaps missile placements and other things that we've looked at in the past. So, you know, if we don't sell more defense systems into the Middle East, the Chinese defense systems will do so. If we don't do more exercises with Middle Eastern partners, then they'll do the military exercises with these partners. And so if we wish to put our heads in the sand and do nothing or pay no attention to China's engagements in the Middle East, then the consequences are something we need to recognize, which is we should expect China to become increasingly dominant, especially in the cyber and information tech systems throughout these countries.
Thank you, Joshua. I wanted to, for the Q&A, I wanted to kind of circle back on what Jon said in his opening remarks about China being an opportunistic nation. In other words, taking advantage of U.S. mistakes, sort of learning from, you know, Washington's experience in the Middle East over the last several decades. Jon, I want to know if you could kind of expand upon that a little bit, and how successful has China been as an opportunist, in your opinion?
Sure. Well, first, I would say China's been pretty successful as an opportunist in the Middle East. China compartmentalizes its policies in the region, whereby it does not want to get involved in the greatest geopolitical conflicts of the region, if you will. And I think we've seen that. There's two things here I would mention. In the diplomatic sphere in particular, one, the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran is typically pointed to as something, that was, I saw there was one scholar that called it a diplomatic coup in the Middle East. I wouldn't consider it that at all. These negotiations had been going on since 2021 led by Iraq and Oman. This is very low hanging fruit for China to swoop in and say, oh my gosh, look at what we brokered. And plus the lessening of tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran were due primarily to developments within Saudi Arabia and Iran. But even on the Israel matter, and particularly post October 7th, we saw China repeatedly, talking about the need for a two-state solution. This is, a longstanding Chinese policy. And we saw them, bring Arab leaders to Beijing, host these summits and so on and so forth. But I think the past 20 months really show a lot of the limits of Chinese power in the region. China has put forward I think it was a 5 or 4 point proposal for solving the Israel-Palestine conflict. There is zero appetite within Beijing to enforce any sort of agreement or really put any real stake in an agreement. And we can talk about the Houthis too. I think the past 20 months really show the limitations of Chinese power in the Middle East. And where I approach the issue from is, what are America's core interests in the Middle East? And I would say there are three. One is the free flow of oil out of the region. Two is preventing terrorist attacks against the American homeland. And three is the prevention of a regional hegemon. And I would say China's interest, or China's ability to undermine any of those, is rather limited. So my greatest concern comes from this overreaction whereby the China card is used as a new catch-all justification for deep American engagement in the Middle East, when deep American engagement in the Middle East has been so disastrous for the United States. So this is where I approach it from, saying this could be a catalyst for a course correction in the Middle East, whereby we recognize that to a large extent, the problems the United States faces in the region is a product of our own presence, partners, and policies. Or we could, kind of double down on this zero-sum competition with Beijing and let that guide our foreign policy, which I would be more skeptical of.
Joshua, I want to go to you too. I think you might have a slightly different interpretation of what China is maybe trying to do in the region than John does. What's your take on maybe the threat of taking China too seriously, or is the United States actually inflating China's capacity to change the region to its benefit?
I really appreciate this opportunity to hear this different perspectives. In the three, I just want to say I didn't hear Israel among the three. So I'm curious if John can talk about whether or not he thinks that Israel is a U.S. priority and how, things have changed in that regard. So that was something that jumped to mind. But I would say that, when I look at what China's doing, I see it has a geostrategy, right? And then it has a strategy in the global south, and it has regional strategies, which it's applying. So to understand what China's doing in the Middle East or Africa or any region in particular, I think you have to see it as part of kind of a larger effort that China's doing. And we, the United States, are the target of that effort, right? We are what they call the primary contradiction, right? That's what Mao called it, right? So we are the primary contradiction. And then China's efforts in these different regions, they have, micro objectives, yes, but there is a fundamental objective. And that is to, whether it be displace the United States or rival the United States in the kind of global system, right? So I think that looking at what's going on in the Middle East in a vacuum, one could argue that we shouldn't be paying much attention. But if you step back and you think of it as part of a kind of larger geostrategy that China's pursuing of undermining U.S. interests and embedding its technology in systems throughout the global south in particular and throughout the world, right? We can see it in Europe, we can see it in the United States. To me, I think then we have to take it more seriously, because I think that the question is like, are you taking a more narrow view of security, or are you taking a larger view of security? And I think that the perspective you take is going to help you come to a different outcome. But when I look at China's geostrategy, I do not, as I said, see the Middle East as a fundamental component, but I do think that every place they can install Huawei, every place they can dominate the cell phone market, every place that they can ensure smart city technology is adapted, facial recognition, and that these things are tethered back to companies in Beijing, cameras, all of this stuff is part of a kind of a new kind of, maybe new Cold War is a little too cliche, but a new rivalry, right? And it's on new turf. And I think I just want to pull us into understanding that I think that's an important part of the discussion, as much as, oil and terrorist attacks and prevention of a regional hegemon, which I agree are important. But I think we can't forget these other components.
Rose, what about you? I saw you were kind of furiously writing notes over there. I wanted to see
Yeah.
what's on your mind here.
What's my scribbling?
I'm
my
nervous.
mad scribbling. Yeah. So let me just preface this by saying that I'm pals with Josh. So I know that Josh likes having a debate, and I'm taking that under advisement. So here's the thing. I think there's a lot of Cold War thinking and 20th century thinking by people who are saying that they are not doing 20th century thinking. So I think a lot of what you are arguing, Josh, actually does come out of 20th century thinking and is not examining the analogy. And what I tried to do in my comments and also in my paper is really examine that analogy, right? So the idea that the US should be worried about, are we keeping up with the Chinese in arms sales to the region, right? Or what if China starts, getting more market share in the region, and they're doing all this tech stuff that we're not doing? And I agree with you, techno surveillance and techno authoritarianism is bad stuff, but these are authoritarian governments either way. If they get the tech from China or they get it from us, they're going to use it the same way, right? So, but setting that aside, this idea that if China is engaging with their markets, or if China's, selling arms to them, they're not anywhere near eclipsing the amount of arms to us. So I don't want to sort of suggest that they are, but that somehow threatens the United States, or is a rivalry that the United States needs to worry about, is very much Cold War thinking and 20th century thinking, right? And if you sort of drill down and really look at, what was the Cold War about, and why were the Soviets a threat, right? The whole reason why we cared about what they were doing, it all went to Europe and whether they could conquer Europe. And then the Middle East mattered because it mattered in their ability to potentially conquer and hold Western Europe, right? Now, the geography of the conflict or potential conflict between the US and China and Asia is totally different than Cold War Europe. But still, this idea that we need to worry and keep score with like every single thing the Chinese are doing in every region of the world, that comes from this Cold War idea that we were in this massive geopolitical competition with the Soviets that the Middle East could play a big role in determining. And that's just not the case with China. And it's not the case because A, China can't threaten the Middle East anywhere near like the Soviets could, and B, the main US interest, oil, is just a totally different market. We are, China is in the same international market, the same global market that we are. And markets are amazing, right? Like markets can solve a lot of these problems that we might worry about. Like China can't, prevent us from having access to these markets in the way that the Soviets could. So anyway, just to like throw that match out there and light the spark. So, have at it.
Spark is lighted. John, you want to add something?
Yeah, no. So just to go off of that, I guess that was somewhat of my biggest question when Josh was presenting, was two things here. One, on the arms in particular, I think the ability of nations in the Middle East to transition wholesale to Chinese weapon systems is almost non-existent because they are so rooted in American doctrine and American technology, which is incompatible with Chinese weaponry. On the second part regarding the AI and the surveillance stuff, I do think that stuff is important and will probably only increase in importance moving forward. But I guess I'm more on the side of Rose here, in that I don't see that as a geostrategic consequence to the United States. And I think, yes, like China could definitely provide these states to do some pretty nasty stuff, surveil people, hack into their stuff. But for anybody who's interested, I would go read this report by Reuters about Project Raven, which was created by the United States and an Emirati firm called Dark Matter. These countries have the surveillance and hacking capabilities that they currently have, thanks in large part to us. That this was product of the post 9/11 world, the global war on terror. The United States poured billions of dollars and sent CIA, NSA, all these people over to these countries to establish these surveillance powerhouses, which believe it or not, were not used to actually target terrorists. They were used to target everybody from American civilians or citizens to just people all over the world. So I would say the capability of these countries to do the nasty things that they do, and they are nasty, is already there. They already have this capability. They're already doing it. Whereby China provides them with new technology to do that, and then that undermines American interests, I'm a little more skeptical. And I really do stick to the three core interests in the Middle East: oil, terrorism, and regional hegemony. And I know you mentioned Israel, Josh, but I don't view really America's relationship with any country in the Middle East or around the world as anything that should be taken as holy or sacred. I think every country and every relationship should be approached from a perspective of concrete U.S. interests, whether it be Israel, Canada, South Korea, Botswana, any of them. So I would say if we continue from this baseline of American minimal interest in the Middle East, but also recognizing that at the current moment we have to prioritize, because we are $36 trillion in debt, running $2 trillion a year deficits. We are greatly overextended between Ukraine, funding the war in Gaza, and trying to deter China in the Indo-Pacific. And I would say the latter of all of those, trying to deter China, is the most important of geopolitically to the United States. I would say the United States finds itself in a position right now where it needs to prioritize. We can't have it all everywhere. I think it was Stephen Wertheim who had an article in Foreign Affairs. I think it was just called "America Can't Have It All" or something like that. And I would suggest that to the listeners here. These are kind of the perspectives that I approach the region with.
Joshua, you have a lot to respond to, so I'm going to let you take the floor here.
No, this is great. I was a high school debater, so I enjoy this back and forth. It's cathartic in a way. But, I just return us to the point, that we came here, right? So should the U.S. be concerned about Chinese engagement in the Middle East? Okay. That doesn't mean that we should necessarily take them as our key rival and fight to the bloody death, but should we be concerned about it, right? That's a lower bar. And I would say that it's pretty clear we should be really concerned about it. And I would say there's a few reasons why. And I think it's because, as I said, as I began with, the Communist Party of China is not an economic organization. It's a political one. So while markets are powerful, the Communist Party of China has proven time and again that it can use its power to overcome market forces and to push against market forces. The creation of entire industries in which it's channeling the vast resources of China in ways that markets would definitely not go. And so Xi Jinping on January 6th, 2013, gave a speech to the Central Party School in which he declared essentially war against the West. He said, be prepared for a rivalry with the West. We're going to tear the West apart. Get on board. And so whether or not we would like this issue to be resolved, the Chinese have made a decision, and that decision is to, basically, create a rivalry with the United States in the South China Sea and in various areas around the world. And so we've got to I understand that we have agency here, but they have agency too, right? And their agency is pretty clearly on the side of this is a geopolitical rivalry in every corner of the world. So while I would love to choose the venues and say this is off limits and that's off limits, Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. We live in this connected world where if you run all of the technology in the Middle East, the amount of facial recognition, the faces you're collecting, the data you're collecting, every time we go in and out of these countries, the Chinese cell towers are collecting on us. They're literally building the AU headquarters. They built it and they hacked it, right? And so, there is question here. If China goes and builds the infrastructure, builds the foreign ministries, and builds the backbone, it's not just about whether they're repressing the local population, which I think we can all agree is bad, but has been going on since time immemorial. The point is their ability to control the information and technology flows throughout the entire region. And that, I would say, is a brave new world issue that we have to grapple with here in ways that we haven't in the past. In terms of whether or not countries can shift dynamically to Chinese technology on the military side, I first have to say I'm not a military guy, but the Chinese are making a lot about how Pakistan took out Indian jets with their hypersonic technology. They're basically running an advertising campaign and saying, we can get you the good stuff. And so I do think that Pakistan transitioned mostly, right? I mean, I'm not an expert in Pakistan, but to Chinese technology. So if Pakistan can do it, maybe other countries can too. So I do think these Chinese arms suppliers are interested, especially in providing the kinds of technologies that would interweave the People's Liberation Army more closely with the militaries of this region. So I do think that there's a strategic component to the military one as well. And I would just kind of conclude by saying, I think we need to get our head around the idea that the Communist Party of China's ambitions are bounded only by, and that as its capacities grow, its ambitions will grow as well. And there is no way that we can, because it's not our choice, it's a choice made in Beijing. We can't sidestep that discussion. The fact that they have termed us enemy number one, look, that's just the world we're living in. Now, how do we respond to it? That's our decision. And so I would say that, getting back, do we have to be concerned about Chinese engagement? I would say, yeah, we damn well better be concerned because it is targeted at us. And it's important that we are concerned and we respond in ways that make sense, right? Not go all in, not go crazy haywire, pretend Chicken Little, the sky is falling, but to do so in a strategic and calculated fashion that basically defends U.S. interests.
Rose, I wanted to kind of ask you how the regional powers are responding to this. I mean, just to take one, tidbit here, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia seems to be quite adept at trying to have it both ways between the United States and China. I think it's pretty obvious that the Saudis and the Emiratis, for that matter, want a very profitable economic relationship with Beijing, even as they kind of try to attempt to bolster their security relationship with the United States. Do they see sort of this U.S. China competition firsthand? And if so, what's their strategy for managing it? Is it just to play one off the other, or is it something I'm not thinking of right now?
Yeah. So I would say, one thing to that, and then I would, piggyback on what others have said. So, like I have a 4-year-old. I figured out a long time ago that you play your parents off each other as much as you possibly can, right? And, the fact that these Middle Eastern countries are doing that, I think signifies a couple of things, right? One is that they understand China is not especially threatening. If they were really threatened by China, I don't think they
Well, it looks like CENTCOM has hacked Rose's feed again. All right.
You hate it when that happens,
Oh,
man.
just mind your own business, CENTCOM. John, John, go ahead.
Yeah, because Rose and I have spoken about this before, and I think we see it pretty similarly. I would say countries in the region are pursuing a two-tiered strategy to best advance their own interests. One is a short-term strategy. The other is a long-term strategy. In the short term, I would say, like what Rose was saying, is that these countries are manipulating this fear within Washington, D.C. to try and exploit concessions out of the United States. And they're very upfront about it. If you talk to them, they will tell you right to your face. There was a really great quote in the Wall Street Journal where a Saudi official said, like, hey, we hope to use fear in Washington, D.C. over China to get nuclear concessions and that formal security guarantee. So that's kind of the short-term strategy, is this reverse leverage. But I would say there's a long-term strategy here too by these countries, which really recognizes multipolarity as a reality, and they're positioning themselves accordingly to benefit from this. They do not view China as a threat. So what they're trying to do, I would say, this is just my opinion, is that what they're trying to do in the long term here is send multiple signals to multiple actors to best advance their own interests. And we should expect this in a multipolar world. We should expect that they're going to praise Beijing one day and, praise Donald Trump and give him a sword dance the next day.
Rose, before you were hacked,
Yes.
Go ahead and please finish your point.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point's been made that they're playing the U.S. and China off each other, and they see it as an opportunity to get concessions from the U.S. and from China both, and that's great for them, I suppose. It's not great for the U.S., but I think I would also just zoom out again and say, I mean, Josh made the point that China's choosing the venue, and they see us as the big rival, and they're choosing to try to rival us in all these different domains across Africa and the Middle East, all these other places. Which again is a lot like the Cold War, right? So a big debate during the Cold War is, do we have to contain the Soviets everywhere, or should we focus on containing the Soviets where it matters, right? And if you try to contain the Soviets everywhere, right, then you end up getting involved in Chile, where Pinochet is overthrown, or I'm sorry, where Allende is overthrown, and the U.S. helps overthrow him, right? Like, just because China thinks it makes sense to expend resources all over the world doesn't mean it actually makes sense. And if they want to do that, right, if they want to throw money at Africa and the Middle East that they're probably going to lose money, like lose their investments on, then I think the U.S., it makes sense for us to say, go for it, right? Have at it. We're going to prioritize the areas that matter to us, that make sense to us, that could be threatening to us. And I think the clear priority would be Asia and East Asia, not all of these places around the Middle East where China can't really pose a major threat, right? So yeah, if they want to throw money at the Middle East, and if local Middle Eastern regimes are happy to take it and are happy to, play the U.S. off of China, that's fine. But I don't see how that actually hurts U.S. interests in any way. The whole Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, it's huge. It's like literally like $1 trillion or more, right? And a lot of this money China's probably never going to see again. If they want to go around and spread their largesse around the world, that just drains them, right? The U.S. has a chance to be smart, and being smart means that you don't respond to every single thing they do everywhere in the world just because they do it.
Joshua, I'm sure you want to respond to Rose and John, but I wanted to add another question on top of that, which is, does China have a specific country in mind in the Persian Gulf specifically? Or is it more of a kind of throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks strategy? Or is it a very, deliberate geoeconomic strategy with, let's say, the Saudis in particular, to kind of peel them away from Washington's, quote unquote sphere of influence, if that's even an accurate description of reality at this current time?
Yeah, no, this is a fascinating conversation. I mean, I'm actually working on a project right now about small powers and their handling, a rising China and U.S. China rivalry. Rose knows I was just in the Czech Republic last week doing this. I'll be in Singapore and Malaysia asking just these questions. So I certainly I agree that, the way small powers gain leverage is, by hedging, right? Playing the large off of one another. But simply because those countries are doing those things, which I think they definitely are, doesn't mean that the Chinese strategy isn't U.S. focused, right? And if the Chinese decide their strategy is U.S. focused, then we need to be concerned about it, right? And again, the threshold is like, should we be concerned about it or should we not be concerned? And I know that sounds somewhat binary. I think the real question is, how concerned should we be, right? And so I would say that we shouldn't be so concerned that we leverage, pushing China out of the Middle East as our primary, secondary, or even tertiary objective. But we should be concerned about it because when we see what China does, when it's able to, say, have a country become deeply indebted, like a country like Pakistan, then it becomes, or like a country like Ethiopia or Angola, there's so many, if you're a banker in Beijing, you're probably wringing your hands. We debt trapped ourselves if you're a banker. But if you're from a geostrategic perspective, again, you're the Communist Party of China, you've gained quite a lot of leverage in these countries. There's a reason why over the last 10 years, one recognizes Taiwan, and that's Eswatini. 10 years ago, there were almost a dozen. And so you can see that China is able to gain leverage in order to achieve its specific strategic objectives. And so it does this in a variety of manners. But I do think that we need to be concerned about it, because as China is able to kind of proliferate its technology within this space, it matters to us, right? We should also be concerned if, for example, China, Israel become, closer in terms of their sharing. That could be a problem for us. But it should not be the top concern. Agree on that 100%. I do believe that there's a bit of China gone crazy syndrome going on, and I do believe our China policy needs to be a bit more focused. I agree with Rose that that East Asia is the primary focus of that. Because that's the primary focus that China has, right? China is most interested in its region, and therefore we should be most concerned about China's behavior in the East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and the South China Sea, and on the Indian and Bhutanese border. I mean, that just makes sense. But that doesn't mean we should turn a blind eye or not be concerned about what's going on in the Middle East. And I think we can walk and chew gum, right? The U.S. government, Doge notwithstanding, is plenty big. And I do think that we can have people doing, primarily focused on one area, but also not being shocked or surprised. China, is able to maneuver itself throughout the Middle East in a way that I think we'd agree is quite deft, right? That it's able to kind of find a way to kind of be agnostic on a lot of issues and not get pulled into things, I think, in a way that is actually quite surprising sometimes. I'd be curious to know from Rose and John how you think China's pulled this off, been able to engage the Israelis, the Saudis, the Iranians, the Gulf states, etc., even the Houthis, is so effectively.
John, do you have an answer for us?
Yeah, I would say the reason why they've been able to do so effectively is because of this strategy of compartmentalization, whereby they engage the region from a perspective of concrete Chinese interests. And I would say Washington would do well to learn this. It would do well to engage with all actors. It would do well to engage from a perspective of concrete interests and not ascribe to this overarching idea of American primacy in the region. That's where we have failed so miserably. I would say, and I think you hinted at it there, Josh, was that China has been pretty successful in navigating these different tensions and different flashpoints in the region. And I would say that's because they don't ascribe any sort of exceptionalized nature to any of them. It just approaches cold-cut Chinese interests from a basis of cold-cut Chinese interests. And I would say that the United States would be well to do the same. And I think sometimes the trap that we fall into is you mentioned, Pakistan is a little different, but you mentioned, Ethiopia and Angola. I would say the strategic significance of either of those to the United States is virtually zero. So, I would, we ascribing strategic significance to a country just because China might be interested in that country or is doing something in that country, I think is a trap that could suck the United States in a direction that is just detrimental. But something that Rose mentioned before that I think is so critical is the money. Follow the money. Show me the money. And I think the U.S. case is really instructive here. So China's defense or military budget, if you want to consider it in purchasing power parity terms, is roughly $471 billion. For the United States to maintain its current presence in the Middle East, it's roughly $100 billion a year. That's absent any war or anything like that. Eugene Goals was the one who put together probably what is the most detailed assessment of what U.S. involvement in the Middle East costs on an annual basis. I think it was in the book that you edited, Rose, if I remember correctly. And that was about $70 billion back in 2019, adjusted for inflation and considerable U.S. buildup in the region since. It's about $100 billion a year. That's about 21% of China's entire military budget. So the idea that China would be able to assume any sort of a position akin to what the United States has or undermine us in a way that's detrimental to our interests, it would have to require them to dramatically increase their commitments to the region and use money that they just don't have. So I think, again, just, and also I would say any diversion of attention or resources away from the Indo-Pacific towards the Middle East would allow the United States to squeeze China harder in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's what they're most concerned about. And I think they love seeing the United States get continuously sucked back into the Middle East and, our attention shift from the Indo-Pacific back to the Middle East constantly. So again, I would say that's kind of the perspective that I use when examining this.
Rose, I want to go back to the Red Sea case study, because as all of us here know, the Houthis have been kind of menacing or attempting to menace civilian and military ships going through the Suez, going towards the Red Sea, Strait of Hormuz. Well, sorry, not Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb towards the Suez. China's, response to that was sort of surprising in a way, because essentially it was a very hands-off approach, whereas the United States organized or attempted to organize a multilateral, military coalition to, number one, shoot down whatever rockets and drones were sent our way, and of course to we transformed that into offensive kinetic action against hundreds of Houthi targets over 12 months time span. Is there a way, is China like reticent to get involved in like the intricacies of Middle Eastern politics, or is it just, or was it a deliberate strategy to basically let Washington and its European allies kind of take the load, or is it both? I suppose it could be both.
Yeah, so I would say that they are reticent. Often the argument is made that the United States is in the Middle East providing security, which helps oil, non-volatile, helps them stay stable.
It looks like Rose's connection is a little messed up here. Joshua, do you want to comment on that? I mean, I'm sure you've watched Chinese involvement in the Red Sea very, very closely. I wonder to what extent China is maybe a little hesitant to get involved in kind of like the muck of the region's politics.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. But before I do that, why don't I pass it back to Rose? She was saying.
Yeah, thanks. I'm so sorry, guys. I don't know what's up with my internet today. Clearly, I did something to offend the internet gods. China's reticent, but it's not that they're free riding on us, because it's not clear that U.S. military action benefited anybody, right? It didn't benefit China, it didn't benefit the U.S., et cetera, because the Houthis just weren't able to impose significant costs on shipping, right? Shipping rerouted around around Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and costs went up ever so slightly, but it was something like 0.001% on the value of the cargo ship, right? You pay a little bit more to go around the southern coast of Africa, and it just has not had a major impact on the global economy, right? Despite worries that Houthi attacks on shipping would cause inflation to go crazy, global inflation, not just in the US, but global inflation has gone down during the course of that entire campaign. So, I think China looked at it and wisely said, we don't need to do anything because these guys are not able to seriously harm the global economy. So why should we bother, right? They weren't even just free riding on the US. Nobody got anything out of it. And we were the ones dumb enough to try.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's correct. I mean, if you look at the military efficacy of U.S. operations, it was pretty limited, and I think that's a charitable term to use, is limited. I mean, in reality, nothing seemed to change in terms of cargo going through those waters. So we're heading to the top of the hour. I think it would be good to maybe take a beat and maybe spend 3 or 5 minutes each on a critical question is essentially, where does the Trump administration go from here? If we take it as a baseline that Chinese involvement in the Middle East in some capacity is a given and a reality, which it is, how does the administration sort of manage that adequately, in your opinion? Joshua, you can go first if you'd like, and then John, and then Rose, you can close us out.
I hate to do this, but since I didn't, could I punt on that and go a little bit later? Because I think that these folks who are actually experts in the Middle East policy might have some great insights, and I can maybe, yeah.
Sure, of course. John, you want to kick us off, and then Rose?
Yeah, kick us off with final comments?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, so again, I think justifying U.S. Middle East policy on the basis of great power competition is a recipe for disaster. Our interests in the Middle East are minimal. The ability of China to undermine these interests is inherently limited. The PRC really lacks the ability and the will to assume a dominant position in the region akin to what we have for decades. And I would say that failing to recognize that risks producing an overreactive and a counterproductive U.S. Foreign policy in the region, particularly given that our interests in the region are so limited. There is nothing in the Middle East worth fighting China over. I think that's something that should be emphasized time and time again. I would say instead of doubling down on what is decades of failed U.S. policies in the region, we should seize this moment and begin to disengage ourselves from the Middle East, disentangle ourselves. Centering U.S. Middle East policy on competition with China will accomplish the opposite. It will suck us in deeper and perhaps with levels of commitment that we haven't even seen yet. Because I would say, it didn't get brought up a whole bunch, but the security guarantee that was floated around a lot during the Biden administration was ultimately predicated, or whether they joined the Abraham Accords and then got the security guarantee, that was ultimately predicated on the basis of creating a more formal coalition through which to combat China. And that was the justification that was carrying the day on Capitol Hill of why we need to give them a security guarantee, which would be historic and also, I would say, a historically bad choice. So I would say recognize these limitations, move the Middle East down to the bottom of America's priority list, and start reducing our levels of regional commitments to a level concomitant with U.S. interests.
Thank you, John. Rose, please go ahead.
Yeah. So fingers crossed I can get through a thought without being interrupted. I think that the president needs to be very careful not to get drawn in deeper under the mantle of countering China in the Middle East, because there are actors, local actors, who are using to try to entrap the United States further for their own reasons that probably have very little to do with China. And the big case there is Saudi Arabia, right? Geez Louise.
Well, in addition to CENTCOM not liking Rose, I don't think the Saudis like Rose either. So, Joshua, please close us out here. And you're muted, by the way.
Yes, that's my fault, not the CENTCOM. So yeah, look, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt amongst us that the PRC isn't really looking to dominate the Middle East at this point, or prioritizing the Middle East as part of its agenda. Rose, would you like to finish your thought? Okay. All right. We won't tempt the gods further, but that the PRC isn't looking to dominate the Middle East first and foremost. It is prioritizing its region, particularly the issue of Taiwan, South China Sea issues. These are really at the core of Chinese strategic priorities. That being said, I do think we need to be concerned, because I do think China is making inroads, not only in a political sense by being able to cultivate these many actors, as John was talking about, to play this kind of balancing act. In part, I don't really know about these rivalries, so I'm just going to, part of it's a language issue. The Chinese government speaks the language of development. They speak it well. They don't really speak the language of like intra-Islamic rivalry. So they just kind of opt out of it, right? And I think that's served them well to some degree. One thing that hasn't been mentioned here is the Uyghur issue, and that China, if it were to get very deeply involved in certain places, then perhaps there could be rivalries that could undermine its position in Xinjiang or create support for the Uyghurs, which at this point in the Middle East is basically at a zero marker because China's engagement has been so effective. But if they did choose sides, if they did get more involved, but as we've been saying so far, they haven't done that. Instead, what I've seen and what I think we've seen is a gradual, slow process of investment through economic, strategic support, this $400 billion deal with Iran, a strategic partnership, 25 years. It's like a stake in the ground, right? If Iran wins, then great, the Chinese get in. If Iran gets hit by Israel and then China comes in and rebuilds it, right? So it's like a win-win where the Chinese win twice, right? So they've been very good at setting these markers down, establishing close political relationships across the region, and expanding in a kind of bit by bit, step by step manner that really isn't all that concerning at this time. But I could see a scenario where if we turn our blind eye completely, right? If we say this is non-issue and we look completely, that we could wake up in a decade from now and basically the entire infrastructure, technology would be built Chinese companies, that Chinese cars, that China would dominate the economy of these regions and the technology of these regions in ways that could seem to undermine U.S. interest. So I don't think we should be unconcerned with it. But again, I don't think we should be over concerned. Maybe the Goldilocks level of concern is what we should be aiming at here.
Rose, did you want to say a few words before we head out, or do you want to call it?
All right, I'm gonna try.
Okay.
And I'm so sorry again. Yeah, we need to not get further entrapped because local regimes say, but China is coming, but China is coming, but China is coming. I was heartened that they did not announce during Trump's trip a new security guarantee to Saudi Arabia, but that could still be in the works. There is a deal being discussed where the U.S. Helps Saudi Arabia not just have a civilian nuclear program, but have a civilian program that has enrichment in Saudi Arabia, which is pretty difficult to do if you're telling Iran they can't have enrichment. But that's not a great, in general, I think nuclear weapons are not as scary as most people assume, but the world is better off with fewer of them. And helping the Saudis to enrich could potentially put them on a path to getting nuclear weapons. And that makes no sense whatsoever. But the thing that the Saudis keep saying is, well, okay, we'll turn around and get it from China if we don't get it from you. And that's exactly the sort of thing that the U.S. needs to avoid doing. They need to avoid, cutting off their nose to spite their face and saying, well, we don't really want you to have nukes, but if you're going to get them, you should get them from us, right? That's just completely the wrong idea, the wrong way of approaching the region.
All right. Thank you, Rose Kelanic, Jon Hoffman, Josh Eisenman. Thank you all three for being here. It was a great discussion, great debate. And I want to encourage everybody that's viewing this to keep on the lookout for more scheduled events from Defense Priorities, as well as policy papers that are going to be rolled out shortly. So thank you for joining us. Thank you all three, and we'll talk later. Take care. Bye.